let's see. There it is. All right, so let's continue this conversation we're having in the pre-show here really quickly. Once you get to that point, there's further observations that are available for you to make, right? Once you're at that point where you say, okay, this is such a radical embrace of Darwinism that to be a materialist and disagree with this Jamesian perspective, you're going to have to give up on Darwinism, because what he's saying is we are the product of our environment. We are the product of our environment. And what fits in better with our environment, with whatever's around us that's having this shaping effect, is to develop personality. That there must be some personality external to ourselves involved. And it's just a radical embrace of it, which, so again, is not what the objectivists were imagining was going to happen in that direction, right? Because they're not considering that type of thing to begin with in order to do their science. But once you get to that point, we won't repeat the whole process to get there again. But once you get to that point, then there's all sorts of other things available to you, which is now, wait a minute, hold on a second. We've been looking at it as the conversation between my environment and the individuals and the populations and the species. But there's also a talking back, right? It's a two-way conversation. So it opens up a whole bunch of other fertile fields of investigation that were sort of closed off if you were limiting yourself just to the cartoonish simplification of a, let's call it a materialist Darwinism or an objectivist Darwinism. It's a radical embrace of Darwinism that is so it's complete, right? It's not like he's pretending to embrace Darwinism or saying, well, I'm okay with that, but also there's this other thing. No, he's saying if we just embrace it like it's the truth we know more than any other truth, it still gets us right back to where we started from. And so that's the answer to the question of that intellectual tradition and
Yeah.
thread that's being expressed in Peterson. So sorry we didn't start the recording earlier for that. That's the end of that conversation. Let's jump into Peterson now and see where we go.
And you get ready to move. Things that upset us rely on that system. And then the Marduk story, for example, is the idea that if there are things that upset you, chaotic, terrible, serpentine, monstrous, underworld things that threaten you, the best thing to do is to open your eyes and get your speech organized and go out and confront the thing and make the world out of it. And it's staggering. When I read that story and started to understand it, just blew me away that it's such a profound idea. And we know it's true too, because we know in psychotherapy, for example, that you're much better off to confront your fears head on than you are to wait and let them find you. And so partly what you do if you're a psychotherapist is you help people break their fears into little pieces, the things that upset them, and then to encounter them one by one and master them. And so you're teaching this process of eternal mastery over the strange and chaotic world. And that all of that makes up some of the background. We haven't even got to the first sentence of the biblical stories yet. But
This is where we left off.
But all of that makes up the background. So you have to think that we've extracted this story, this strange collection of stories with all its errors and its repetitions and its peculiarities out of the entire history that we've been able to collect ideas. And it's the best we've been able to do. And I know there are other religious traditions. I'm not concerned about that at the moment because we can use this as an example, but it's the best we've been able to do. And what I'm hoping is that we can return to the stories in some sense with an open mind and see if there's something there that we actually need, and I hope that that will be the case. And as I said, I'll approach it as rationally as I possibly can. So, well, this is the idea to begin with, is we have the unknown as such, and then we act in it like animals act. They act first. They don't think, they don't imagine, they act. And that's where we started. We started by acting. And then we started to be able to represent how we acted. And then we started to talk about how we represented how we acted. And that enabled us to tell stories, because that is what a story is. It's to tell about how you represent how you act. And so you know that because if you read a book, what happens? You read the book and images come to mind of the people in the book behaving, right? It's one step from acting it out. You don't act it out because you can abstract. You can represent action without having to act it out. It's an amazing thing, and that's part of the development of the prefrontal cortex. It's part of the capacity for human abstract thought, is that you can pull the behavior, the representation of the behavior, away from the behavior and manipulate the representation before you enact it. That's why you think, is so that you can generate a pattern of action and test it out in a fictional world before you embody it and die because you're foolish, right? You let the representation die, not you. And that's why you think. And so that's partly what we're trying to do with these stories. What do I hope to accomplish? I hope to end this 12 lecture series knowing more than I did when I started. That's my goal, because I said that, I'm not telling you what I know. I'm trying to figure things out, and 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 this is part of the process by which I'm doing that. And so I'm doing my best to think on my feet. I come prepared, but I'm trying to stay on the edge of my capacity to generate knowledge and to make this continually clearer and to get to the bottom of things. And so I'm hoping that that's what I want to accomplish. And it seems like people are interested in that. So then we're going to try to accomplish that together. And so that's the plan. And the idea is to see if there's something at the bottom of this amazing civilization that we've managed to construct that I think is in peril for a variety of reasons. And maybe if we understand it a little bit better, we won't be so prone just to throw the damn thing away, which I think would be a big mistake. And to throw it away because of resentment and hatred and bitterness and historical ignorance and jealousy and the desire for destruction and all of that. It's like, I don't want to go there. It's a bad idea to go there. And we need to be grounded better. And so hopefully, we'll see how this works. All right, so how do I approach this? Well, first of all, I think in evolutionary terms. As far as I'm concerned, the cosmos is 15 billion years old, and the world is 4.5 billion years old, and there's been life for 3.5 billion years, and there were creatures that had pretty developed nervous systems 300 to 600 million years ago, and we were living in trees as small mammals 60 million years ago, and we were down on the plains between 60 million and 7 million years ago, and that's about when we split from chimpanzees, and modern human beings seem to emerge about 150,000 years ago, and civilization pretty much after the last ice age, something after 15,000 years ago. Not very long ago at all, And that's the span across which I want to understand. That's the span across which I want to understand. I want to understand why we are the way we are.
Okay, let's do something here because there's something I've talked about a lot in some other places, but it needs to be updated. So I'm going to share this graphic here and we'll update it with what Peterson just said. Let's say view, zoom into there. Okay. So let's see what happens if we go like this. Okay, zoom to, shiz. Can we zoom out just a little bit? There we go. Okay, one more. Excellent. All right, let's share this tab. Okay, so this was this map that I made, and it turns out that there's broader regions that he's underpinning all of this in. So we had talked about the dream world, the mythopoetic. These are artists that are getting pictures of the forms that are there, and that, but then they're putting them into something communicative, right? So it used to be. Let me see if I can. Oops. Let me see if I can fix this. Oops. Damn it. Excuse my language. All right. What we don't want to do is that. So we want to say back, back, back. That's not helping. Okay. Forward, 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 forward. I just want to change the view. All right. My bad. Okay. So let's say zoom out a little bit. Okay. Sorry about that. Okay. So if we were to grab this, stinking thing. Okay. All right. So this was the sphere that we were talking about before. And the idea is like, okay, what he's saying is this is all underpinned in something. So really quickly again, we have these artists, but they're linguistically or communicatively through painting and sculpture and drama and narrative and music. They're talking to us. They're communicating to us. And I said that that's out there before you get to the propositional, to the dialectic, to the so there's a dialectic there in the first realm, obviously, but um, there's a back and forth and a relationship with the art and all of that. But in the philosophic realm, now you've got propositions that you can use logic and argue for, to try to like sharpen and see how correct they can get. If you put added restrictions to that, you get into this tighter realm of the scientific, where it's formulaic and it's amenable to empirical consequence, so that you can settle questions in that sort of way. And so these are sort of watching the same dimension evolve as you reduce the rules of the game and the scope of what you can consider. But then there's something very powerful that can be done if the questions you're investigating can be treated properly within those restrictions. But what Peterson's saying here is, we got to zoom out, because this thing here is actually rooted in two other realms. And if I could negotiate this better, there we go. So before you get the mythopoetic language, you have the dream, right? This is still pre-linguistic out here. So this, oh, I can't click that. Why can't I click that? Put that back. Okay, there we go. Okay, so this dream, this pre-linguistic thing, this is just the fact that even lizards are dreaming, right? So the dreaming and images is almost, so you asked the question before we started today, and let's talk about this again. Okay, how is it possible that Reed has this idea that common sense is rooted in something that it could be reliable, right? He doesn't say if something is common sense, it's necessarily true. But what he's saying, oh, look, I could make this better if I just moved this like this. All right. Sorry about that. Okay. And there we can see that a little bit better. Okay. So we'll put that over here and that over here. Bear with me. I'm so sorry. And we'll say fit. And that's not quite working. Okay. All right. Anyway, so I'm so sorry that I wasn't better prepared for doing that. Okay, so what were we saying? So this, okay, so this mythopoetic, it's like the artist is getting in touch with something. But wait a minute, what are they getting in touch with? So Reed had this idea that you don't just agree with something because it's common sense. However, he had this strong suspicion, this Scottish philosopher had this strong suspicion, and he argued for it. So I'm not just saying it's just a suspicion, but that whatever is written into us, there might be things written into us, and the only way that those could be written into us is if they're written into us by nature itself, right? So this is where we can get to that point of a William Jamesian ability to embrace a radical embrace of science and Darwinism, right? Because um Reed's teachings became the foundation of the educational system in America, which is the environment in which Pierce and William James developed their American pragmatism. Okay, which is explicitly making these types of points and trying to say, look, um, if we are the product of the things around us, right? If nature is selecting for death and for non-reproductive advantage, those things which don't fit in well with it, with which it does not approve, right? Without personifying it necessarily, just if you're not fitting in well with the cosmos, then you're not what we're shaping things into being. Well, okay, fine. But what you could do is you could say, well, what did that process shape? It shaped things that have personalities. So if you want to actually embrace it and be consistent, why not say there seems to be a personal element to whatever's outside me in the environment, maybe not in every aspect of it, but maybe in every aspect. It could be panpsychic or could be theistic. But in either way, there's something of personality that's saying, hey, a robot isn't going to fit in well. It's not going to compete as well as something that has personality. So why how can that be unless um, it's a good reflection of the cosmos as a whole, or we are created in the image of God, which is how the mythopoetic original story was saying. But it seems to be saying, or pointing at the same thing at least. Okay. So I had just these three inner spheres because I was dealing with what is it that we can be consciously aware of, right? Our subconscious, this was Jung's point, our subconscious is telling us things. And it's telling us things in imagistic form. It's telling us things in a language as if Freud thought we had the idea worked out, but we didn't want to pay attention to it. But the Jungian perspective is more like um It's telling us things that we don't yet have the ability to articulate. We don't yet have the words for describing it, and yet it can tell us in images and impressions and narratives and in the dream language, right? So what Peterson is saying is like, well, okay, fine. Um, the artist is maybe a very good dreamer, and maybe the ancient processes of maybe millennia of these different tribes working out the dream, the shared common dream, the narrative story about telling us who we are and where we came from, the Ovid's Metamorphoses, the Genesis, right, the Marduk story from the Mesopotamians. These are cultures that are suddenly going from poop throwing, rock wielding apes to cathedral builders and pyramid builders, and the way that they're doing it is, it's suggested, is that they're getting in tune with who they actually are and where they came from. And the language they're using is not the language of, sometimes it is, there's overlap and stuff, but primarily it's not the language of propositional, argumentative, analytical philosophy. It's the language of, let me tell you a story. Let me tell you a story. It's like this, or God is a character, right? And Abraham is a character, and here's how they're relating, and Jacob is wrestling with God, right? So it's a narrative structure that's depicting the story. It's like Marduk is this character, and everything's in crisis, and being is on the line, and he says, look, the only way I'm going to save everything is if it's proper, and what's proper is that I then become the organizing principle in the future, and you make me the pronouncer of destiny, right? So these language stories are trying to give us a picture in statue and in painting and in the story and in music and in the language of art. It's trying to give us a picture of something true about who we are and the world we live in. And now Peterson is saying, well, so I only had these three inner spheres. But what he's saying is, now, wait a second, hold on. That is how the art is coming about, but the lizards are dreaming too. And they're not maybe depicting their dreams to each other in some sort of a representative manner. And maybe none of the animals are, or as not son of son had come in with some quote unquote receipts. I don't mean to say that there weren't receipts, but I like that phrase. He said, look, there's some evidence that chimpanzees build cathedrals. They build piles of rocks, and it's not clear why they're doing it, but they seem to be making some sorts of forms of something. And elephants, will put flowers and gifts on the bodies of dead animals that are not even elephants. They will bury and have ceremonial looking, like they'll have ceremonies, it seems, about another dead creature. And it's like, well, they're thinking about death, it seems, or they're dreaming about it, or they're acting it out at least. And so Peterson's saying, okay, we've got the dream, and that goes back to our common ancestor with lizards, for goodness sake. What's before that? What's before the dream? Or maybe there's a dialectic between the dream and it's the behavioral. So we'll let him talk about that a bit, but we can open up these spheres. We could say there's all being, and then there's being of organisms, and organisms behave. And the way they behave is a kind of a language. All right. We're not saying it's translatable into propositions. What we're saying is there's a back and forth debate between the behaviors and whether or not they fit in well with things, right? So you could take bacteria and say, well, this bacterium is different than this one in this way. And this one happens to be communicating with everything else around it, not through language. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is its behaviors are like a conversation between all of the parameters that would allow it to thrive better or less well than the competing bacterium next to it that's slightly different in its behavior, right? That's an embrace of Darwinism that's saying, look, you can still find, or let's say this, you can fully and radically embrace Darwinism and not feel for a moment that it is a challenge to purpose, meaning, design, or intention, or an aim and a direction, right? That's what these pragmatists. Well, we're going to be studying them a lot, so I don't want to speak inappropriately or inaccurately about them. But it seems to me that that's what Jordan Peters was. Clearly, that's what Jordan Peterson is pointing out, and I think he's pointing it out and saying, "Look, that's what these pragmatists were about." Was understanding that if you have to do the objectivist fiction in order to come up with that story and only see the one side of it, which is the objective, selecting away things on these poor creatures, well, then maybe that's all you can. Maybe you have to limit your scope of what you'll consider in order to have that brilliant philosophical insight that Darwin had, perhaps. But you've limited what you're willing to consider. There's all sorts of things that you refuse to consider that are obviously true about the universe in order to have that powerful breakthrough. How powerful a breakthrough is it? Well, it opened up 100 billion questions that are now amenable to empirical verification or testing. Right? We can ask all sorts of questions. How did the bill of the beak of this specific species of bird develop based on its environmental history? I mean, that's something that nobody could even like try to make progress on except to just say, well, it's been very well designed. Clearly, I see that part, right? The clearest part is that it's well designed. And so um, Paley is saying, hey, and Paley said this before Darwin was born. Paley died 5 or 6 years before Darwin was born. But he said, look, another way to think about this is that life just tries everything and the things that work stick around. He actually had the Darwinian insight and he said, here's why that's not good enough to explain what I'm seeing clearly as design. And then Darwin came along and said, look, this is the way we can make progress in thinking about ourselves as a species and all of this. And it's not, I think, until and because the idea is so powerful, I think it's intoxicating. And then what gets smuggled in is the objectivist and the materialist perspective, which are you have to take on the objectivist perspective to have that insight, perhaps. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. But that doesn't mean that the insight and all that is accomplished by that insight verifies that that original assumption is true. And we already know it's not. We already know philosophically that, look, from the rationalists and from the Platonic inclination in philosophy that's still alive today, and it's alive in William James, it's alive in these pragmatists. You can think of the pragmatists as Plato in the age of scientism. It's not to say that Plato would agree with them. It's not to say that they were trying to tell you what Plato was saying or anything like that. It's just that psychological instinct. It's like, well, that's still alive. And all we're doing in academia, in the halls of academia, is assiduously trying to avoid everything they're talking about because it makes us have to go from, hey, we've got it all figured out. Just simplify everything first. And then it's just a bunch of little bits of hard stuff. And we can, put mathematical formulas on it to describe the likelihood of a certain outcome given the data starting point. Well, that's really powerful. That's this inner sphere, this inner, let me put it over here, this inner scientific sphere. Hold on. How come that's not showing? There it is. Okay. This inner scientific sphere is extremely powerful. It can accomplish things that you're not going to maybe figure out otherwise, perhaps. But it's nested in something. And that's nested in something else. And that's rooted in something else. And that goes back before you've got conscious creatures. And it goes back or if the panpsychists are right, nothing goes back before that, perhaps. But it goes back before you have creatures that are anything like us. So he's gonna tell this story from this outer realm, right? And one of the ways you could do it is maybe from the overlap between these two outer realms. Maybe we won't go back to bacterium, but you can see it clearly in wolves. You say, look, nobody thinks that the wolves are writing books on wolf ethics. Nobody thinks that the wolves are building statues of the great heroic wolf that is the type of wolf you should want to be like and is admirable just when you stare at it. It's the form of the art is shining out at you. This is a way to be the way humans are. Nobody's saying that that's what wolves are doing. Yet you could look at just their behaviors and say they're behaving according to principles. Well, they didn't invent the principles. They didn't come up with the principles. They didn't debate the principles, but the principles are still there. And then you say, okay, well, what about us? And this pragmatist and this radical embrace of Darwinist approach says it's the same with you. It's the same with humanity. You were already living according to principles and you didn't know it. And you had dreams that would disturb you if you weren't living according to those principles, right? And you had dreams that would inspire you towards a better development or comprehension of those principles. And all of that happened before you made a statue, before humanity made a painting, right? It happened like 250,000 years ago. That was happening. And then we started to engage in actual communication between each other. And the language we had was not immediately this propositional, philosophical, argumentative language, but it was take a look at this, right? Take a look at this. Like, here's a statue. Here's a statue of Venus. We find them all over the planet. I mean, we could just pull up the second year material here, since that's what we're talking about, and we've got pictures of these things. Here's a painting on the wall. Here's a handprint. Here's a gazelle. Here's a whatever. But it's not pointing at objects. It's shouting at us about who we are and what world we live in. And as Jung, so Peterson talked about Nietzsche, he talked about Jung, he talked about narrative. He wants us to understand that these are languages that could be speaking to us about very, very important things that are maybe necessarily that they necessarily have to be understood to a certain threshold if you hope to have even the framework that would make possible the philosophic or the scientific, right? These other realms are nested in something. Look, I'm clicking on the wrong thing. These other realms down here are nested in something and dependent upon it, perhaps. And so that's where the story starts. Okay, so I'm going to stop talking now, but that's the end. That's maybe a fuller answer to this question that you had in the pre-show, Elena, that we were talking about. It's like, okay, what is this? What is this tradition? One of the ways of summing it up when we do this with the second year lenses is we say, okay, look, there's two major psychological instincts. There's almost two vantage points of the dialectic that is the conversation of philosophy, the recorded conversation of the best things people have had to say about trying to understand things in a propositional way, not in an artistic way. So maybe those things are better in some ways, or deeper or more profound. I'm not saying that these statements are the best, but the best record that we've kept of people contributing to this conversation is, it can be understood as a conversation between what we've been calling the Platonic and the Aristotelian, right? Which is just two different instincts. And you need both of them. You can't have one hand clapping, right? You have to have this opposition and this tension between the two. But if that's the case, the answer to the question is what Jordan Peterson is doing is he's saying, look, I've found things of great value and I've in philosophy, and I've found them from these pragmatists, from these archetypal thinkers, from Jung, from William James, from Reed, who's the great grandfather, I think, of William James in the way that we described. There is the Platonic inclination, right? We understood there was Neoplatonism in the medieval ages, and there were the scholastics worshiping Aristotle. But now that we're so taken with this post-Cartesian scientism, it's like all Aristotle. We're more all Aristotle than the medievals were, because we're refusing to listen to the other side of the conversation, which is necessary. And if we do take it away or ignore it, the whole conversation's going to fall. It's necessary to have both sides communicating with each other. And Jordan Peterson, in an age of, look, in an age of the sort of cynicism that you would imagine publicly, I mean, think about what it was. It was like, look, I love these people, so this isn't a criticism at all, right? But if you look at like the popular conversation of people online and people communicating that are living off of the best contributions they can find, right? I'm not trying to pick on these people. This is great stuff. It's Richard Dawkins and it's Christopher Hitchens. And by the way, I have a lot of positive things to say about both of them. So I'm not what I'm saying here is not to say those are the bad guys and he's the hero who changes it all. That's not what's happening. What's happening is the dialectic. You've got great contributors of people, and Hitchens understood. So let's take Hitchens out of this story. Let's not even talk about Richard Dawkins. I don't want to say inaccurate things about him, but I want to make this point. So let's call it the Dawkinites, right? The people who think that what Richard Dawkins was saying to them is you should be satisfied with a very simple story because it's also very magical and beautiful. It's like, yeah, that's one half of the conversation. But what was needed and what was inevitable was the rise of the Platonic instinct again to come back and have an answer to that. And what's inevitable about that rise is the downfalling of the other perspective, which has within it the seeds of its next rise again. There will be another response, right? We're in, again, we don't want to go into all of the second year stuff, but we're in this cyclic repeating thing. And the way we get insights is by going back and forth like this, right? The wings of the bird are pushing against each other and it's achieving elevation, right? So each side is getting more sophisticated as we respond to each other. But it's overdue and this is why I think this is one of the explanations, right? If Jordan Peterson's rise to popularity came just from the fact that he annoyed some woke people and did it with a Socratic commitment to say, look, kill me if you have to, I'm not shutting up about this, which is, of course, extremely attractive. If that was all there was to it, we wouldn't be studying him right now. There's something way deeper. That was great, by the way. There's no criticism to that. But there's something way deeper and more profound that he is bringing to this conversation, which is why there's ongoing conversation between Sam Harris and him. There's the necessity, right? Sometimes people think that the point of a debate, of a personal debate, is to convert somebody to the other side. The point is to never, if somebody switches sides, you should immediately just jump to the other side again or something, because now the conversation's dead. There's nothing to talk about. We don't have the total knowledge. And so even within that sphere of the philosophic, we should want the conversation to keep going. um, let's not go off on too many tangents. The point is, to answer your question of the pragmatism and the common sense and the read, to me, it's like this is the Platonic voice in that conversation making its ascendancy again. And it's like a glass of refreshing water after a desert. I mean, it's like we have been suppressing half of the conversation, which means we've been stuck with something that we can't really live off of. Right. One of the mistakes would be to say, and people do this on Twitter all the time. You can tell it's like they're voting for who the ultimately right person is. Oh, I'm against the Dawkinites. I'm for the Petersonian. Ah, I'm against him. I'm with science. It's like, guys, you need the other side. You need to hear it and you need to be challenged by it. And you don't know enough, and neither does the other side. This thing needs to keep going. And that's so one of the things is how beautiful Jordan Peterson is saying, look, let's take the harshest versions of every criticism of what I'm thinking, and let's do everything we can scientifically to try to pry it up. And let's be as critical as we can about all of this. Let's not just go off in the fancy of saying the dream seems real to me. How could you know? Within his framework, it would take 100,000 years to figure out if the dream was right or not. And nature would figure it out by killing off the people who care about it. Right. It's like this takes thousands of years, 10,000 years at least, to work it out. One person can't deal with, if there is this type of profound reality being communicated in this other realm, it's too profound usually for one person. And when one person is speaking in that way, they speak and others speak of them, like Socrates did with Ion, of saying, well, clearly there's an inspiration here. There's a revelation here. This isn't the skills of a person, right? The skills of a person can make you a very good philosopher. The skills of a person could make you a really good scientist. Most science is so hard to do that people doing it aren't that skilled at it, but we've got a system involved of checks and peer review and stuff to still make it work anyway. But a scientist who could internalize the principles could apply them rigorously and accomplish a great deal. But in this realm of this communication of art and poetry and myth, and trying to dream properly about insights to understand, the way that it gets talked about is inevitably divine revelation or being inspired by the muses or something like that. And we'll look at Ion and Socrates. We're going to be doing that soon. Hopefully we have an artist to interview and to look at her art, and we're going to talk about that process. But it's not accidental. It's not like a bunch of stupid people just had the idea that there could be inspiration, but really there's this clever artist. I'll bring up one example. Scott Adams has a really wild and fantastic book that we looked at in philosophy. Most people don't realize that the Dilbert creator is best known in certain circles as a philosopher, or as the writer of an interesting psychological and philosophical text. But what's interesting about it is, he understands what we're talking about here, but every once in a while on certain topics, he decides, oh, science is the ultimate answer for those things. We're not going to get into that and or try to open up that debate. He's not here to take the other side. But um, when he talked about that book, he said the entire thing came to me in the shower from start to finish like a revelation. Right? It's like, okay, you can pretend that there's no truth to that if you want, but every single artist, when pressed and asked, says that that's how this is like. And so, the idea, so in our scientism post-Cartesian age, it's common for us to say, oh, you believe the Bible was written by God. Ha ha ha. How silly. Don't you realize there's editing and there's adding books and taking away books and arguments about it. Oh, you think like a guy in a beard, he sat down and wrote the thing and then handed it to Moses, and that's where it came from. That's so silly. And it's like, okay, how do you know that? Well, because we have historical facts and we have understanding in our objectivist approach, and that's not how it happened. The response to that from the William James, and this is the last time I'll say it, but again, it's an answer to your question. So we'll wrap up right back on that. Is that the answer to that is you can fully embrace all of that and say, oh, look at this. The cosmos as a whole has written forms and images and dreams that are common between us into us, that is speaking at us. And maybe everybody's dream isn't worth watching. Maybe if everybody was forced to write a novel, it wouldn't be worth reading. But some people are very good dreamers, and some people are inspired, and some people are anointed. And whatever language we have to use it because they're getting in touch with this thing that isn't coming from something that you internalize and reason through. It's too old for that. The editing process takes 10,000 years, and nature itself is writing the book. Well, okay, if you can say that without blushing, that the cosmos as a whole is shaping the culture, and this includes all of the gad sad types who are saying, let's use this evolutionary theory to look at psychology and cultural evolution, and all. It's like, how do you have those fields and presume there's something in them that you could find, unless you recognize the consequences? You're no longer living in a world where subjects can be ignored. You're no longer living in a world where characterological narrative is not the appropriate language for discussing part of what the cosmos is. Right. So I don't want to repeat it again, but this is radical and really interesting in those ways. So um, was it clear enough? Ask some questions, point at it, or should we just hit play again? Because that's the core question, the one you asked.
It was clear and absolutely answered. Thank you.
Any
So I don't have any follow-up questions,
Okay.
or nor do I have something to add.
Okay, we're gonna get into this more because he's gonna keep flushing this out for us. So let's turn on the better voice right here.
Looking at life in its continual complexity, right from the beginning of life itself. And there's some real utility in that because we share attributes with other animals, even animals as simple as crustaceans, for example, have nervous system properties that are very much like ours, and it's very much worth knowing that. And so I think in an evolutionary way, I think it's a grand and remarkable way to think because it has this incredible time span, right? It's this amazing. I mean, people at the end of the 19th century, middle of the 19th century, thought the world was about 6,000 years old. I mean, 15 billion years old, that's a lot more, right? It's a lot grander, it's a lot bigger, but it's also a lot more frightening and alienating in some sense because the cosmos has become so vast, it's either easy for human beings to think of themselves as trivial specks on a trivial speck out some misbegotten hellhole end of the galaxy among hundreds of millions of galaxies, right? It's very easy to see yourself as nothing in that span of time. And that's a real challenge for people. And I think it's a mistake to think that way. Because I think consciousness is far more than we think it is, but it's still something we have to grapple with. I'm a psychoanalytic thinker. And what that means is that I believe that people are collections of subpersonalities and that those subpersonalities are alive. They're not machines. They have their viewpoint, they have their wants, they have their perceptions, they have their arguments, they have their emotions. They're like low resolution representations of you. When you get angry, it's a very low resolution representation of you. It only wants rage, or it only wants something to eat, or it only wants water, it only wants sex. It's you, but shrunk and focused in a specific direction. And all those motivational systems are very, very ancient, very archaic, and very, very powerful. And they play a determining role in the manner in which we manifest ourselves. And as Freud pointed out with the id, we have to figure out how to take all those underlying animalistic motivations and emotions and civilize them in some way so that we can all live in the same general territory without tearing each other to shreds, which is maybe the default position of both chimpanzee and humanity. So I take that seriously, the idea that we're a loose collection of spirits, and that it says in the Old Testament somewhere that the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom, and I think this is akin to that. If you know that you're not in control of yourself thoroughly, and that there are other factors behind the scenes, like the Greeks thought that human beings were the playthings of the gods. That's the way they conceptualized the world. And they sort of meant the same thing. They meant that there are these great forces that move us, that we don't create, that we're subordinate to in some sense. Not entirely, but we can be subordinate to them, and they move our destinies. That was the Greek view. And there's something, it teaches you humility to understand that there's a hell of a lot more going on behind the scenes. And you're the driver of a very complex vehicle, but you don't understand the vehicle very well. And it's got its own motivations and methods. And sometimes you think it's doing something and it's doing something completely different. You see that in psychotherapy all the time because you help someone unwind a pattern of behavior that they've manifested forever. First of all, they describe it, then they become aware of it. Then maybe they start to see what the cause is. They had no idea why they were acting like that. They have to have the memory that produced the behavioral pattern to begin with. It has to be brought back to mind, and then it has to be analyzed and assessed, and then they have to think about a different way of acting, and it's extraordinarily complex. So, psychoanalytic, literary. Well, there's this new.
Yeah, let's stop again. All of that underpinning, he's now moving on to something else here that's really worth highlighting. The ancient Greek mythology, let's look at it for a quick second here and say, okay, there are competitive and cooperative and conversational interactions between a plethora of deities. There's a hierarchy and there's a proper role for a principle at the top of those things, right? Zeus isn't doing what Venus does. Zeus isn't doing what Apollo does, but Zeus is working out through his relationship with Hera. And through his, his mistakes that he's making, he's working out the proper way to organize the kingdom. Is the history of the metamorphoses that are going on, right? So you can see that in the Ion story in the metamorphoses. I'm sorry, the Io story. It's okay. Zeus is because often people will look at Greek mythology and they'll say, "Oh my goodness," especially with our Christianism that we're in, whether, Nietzsche's point that scientism is a sub branch of Christianity. Let's just remember that that exists for a second and say, look, we're living in this scientism age, but there's something extremely Christian about our perspective. And typically, because of the scientism part of it, of that lens that we're used to, through which we're used to looking, there is there's this scoffing. It's like, oh, the Greeks had gods who cheated on their wives. The Greeks had gods who lied and hid their misdeeds and stuff like that. It's like, oh, maybe that's desirable or maybe it's silly. But in either case, we're not understanding the story. So if you look at the Io story in the Metamorphoses, Zeus cheats on his wife. I'm sorry, hold on. And the entire narrative of the story is only comprehensible if you recognize how many problems come into being because there's disorder in the royal kingdom, right? It's and so Zeus cheats and he gets caught because Hera's not stupid. And so he turns his lover, who was a daughter of a Woodbrook, who again, the Woodbrooks are older. They're almost like Titans in a sense. They're older cosmic personality principles at work before Zeus shows up and tries to make the world in which we live, right? So he's relating to things that are older than him still, right? So we can start to get an idea of who these characters are in their relationship to other characters. But he's tempted by this wood nymph, who's again the daughter of one of the river gods, and they have an affair, and she finds out. She's not stupid. Where is he? He's not where he's supposed to be. I'm gonna go. She's very insecure and anxious because she's got a husband that's not making the household very a place for confidence. And so when the ultimate mother and father deities are not at rest, you can just assume that everything else is in chaos, right? Like things are not good for the world. So she shows up and he immediately turns her into a heifer. He turns her into like a baby cow. These are metamorphoses, right? Things that are changing. How do we get what we have now? Well, it had to come from something else, and then the things had to change. This is how he's inspired to tell us the story. And so this is one of those stories. And in it, so it's a domestic animal, right? So if you go back and you say, okay, well, how is it that we live the way we live? Let's say we just boom, we pop into existence and we're living in a an agricultural society There are seasons and there are festivals and there's some art and there's some different institutions and different power structures and there's political intrigue and there's sexual social development of and stories that are going on in the communities around us. There's food and a desire for good food and aims that we have for harvesting food. There's like these are the human concerns are what are defining us. And then somebody comes along to say, "Here, let me tell you how we got to where we are right now, and maybe a little bit about where we're going." And we're in the middle of this story. Well, there was a time when whatever we were didn't include domestic creatures. We didn't have grains that were evolved to be the kinds of things that give us enough nutrients, and that we were designing environments for them to flourish. Horses and cattle, they were just like lions and eagles, like, it's all just other weirdly like, there wasn't this relationship between us and the animal kingdom that included domestication and farming. And so Zeus so in the process of getting us to where we are, one of the stories is that there's something tempting to Zeus. Right? So, how is it that things come to be domesticated? Well, part of it is without people knowing that it's even possible to evolve and domesticate plants and animals into things that are really, really useful for us, we have to at first just be tempted and intrigued and want to get near to them, right? So, it's older than Zeus. It's not the conscious understanding of what we're doing. He's there's a relationship between us and the things that are strange and a part of the environment, but there is a process that happened. And so here's the story of how it happened. It's one aspect of the story. So there's an attraction, there's some tension perhaps in it. But also the thing itself has to be interested in us, right? If we're interested in foxes, but every time we're within 100 feet of one, they immediately hide in the ground and we never come across them, there's not going to be a domestication thing that's happening there. But if we have food and we're throwing it away and we find the creature interesting and we see what would happen if we throw some food to it, or if it comes around our garbage at night, it's like it's attracted to us and we're attracted to it before we understand that there's even the possibility of it evolving into something dependent on us and us evolving into something dependent on it. It's going to change us. Our relationship with it is going to change who we are and what we're structured and what we build and what we know and how we develop a science about it and all of that. And we don't even know that's happening. And it is going to be changed by us, right? The dog, he's not here right now. The dogs we have are not like the wolves, right? They have puppy features in some ways and they're very devoted to us. It's like that's not what it was like when all of the animals were potential threats to us and we didn't have any mastery over them, and we also didn't have any we had very limited ability to understand how to interact with them. So okay, so back to the story. So here's the main thing about what we don't understand about there. And I'm not saying the story is reduced to that, right? I'm not saying the ancient Greek inspired poet was trying to give us a coded version of how domestication happens. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying it's way more profound than that. It's so profound that it also applies to that, and you can understand that is the context. The story is supposed to tell us how we got where we are. Okay. So, one of the things that stops us from understanding this is that we look at Zeus and we say, who could believe in a god like that? This is silly. Apollo, he's the god of a lyra and of medicine, and he kills one of his lovers, and he is chasing Daphne in the woods, and he's got a son, and he bakes a cherry. Like these are just all seem like random things that don't connect in any way. The Jordan Peterson suggestion that we're going to see flushed out with, I think there's the Jungian keys for understanding these stories are a part of what we're going to get from this class. But the suggestion is there are keys. There's a way to have the sort of ears that can hear what's in the story. And again, it doesn't let you reduce it, right? This is why Peterson, we're going to see, is always using the phrase, the story means at least that much, right? He's not saying, oh, I've understood the story so perfectly that I could just turn it into just read this. You don't have to care about the story anymore. He says, no, every time I go back, I get a new layer of meaning from it. So back to Zeus and Io really quickly. So that's the start of the story. But then everything that happens in the story is Hera trying to get Zeus to confess in this affair of his and him doubling down on different types of deceptions. And the consequence of all of that is that no matter how clever he tries to be to ignore and hide and get away with this thing, eventually there's just more and more chaos. It's more and more the kingdom is not thriving because he still hasn't worked out the proper way to relate to these things. And it's at the end that Zeus actually repents. Right? Zeus says, "Okay, I'm not going to do this anymore. You're right. We're not, Hera, let's be reconciled." And but Hera's attempts and his attempts to hide, and then her attempts to expose, and then his attempts to be like, look, the world is suffering. Hera is being quite unkind to this heifer, and this isn't good, right? Zeus could be thought of as, okay, this is going to wrap up right to what Peterson was talking about. So he says, I'm a clinical psychologist. Okay, so what's one dimension for understanding these stories? Say, well, there's a hierarchy of personalities in your brain, whether you like it or not. And maybe your psychology is run amok because some principle that's supposed to have an important role to play is sitting on Zeus's throne. So, what does Zeus represent? He doesn't represent the ultimate cosmic answer to everything. He's evolving too. What he represents, at least, is, it seems to me, the vision for caring about what's good, wanting to get it right, and understanding that the world could be more than it is. And so at the end, at the crisis moment where it's like, look, things are getting bad. We have to fix this. And if what it takes to fix it is for me to admit that I shouldn't have done what I did, that I should relate properly to this other Hera princess, because she suffers. She becomes deeply insecure and anxious, and the deity that she uses to watch over the heifer is one with eyes, thousands of eyes all over him. It's like that psychological place of anything can happen at any moment. It's like the hell of that part of chaos is in the story. So we won't look at the whole story in to take too much time. But the point to take away first is that what is in the image that's being discussed is telling us something. It's not arbitrary. Cupid in the Apollo story has a bow and arrow. He doesn't have a torch, right? So his mother, Venus, she burns lovers with passion, but Cupid is a different principle and he flies higher than the other deities, right? So the image of the sharp arrow is meaningful to communicate what needs to be communicated. The type of god of demigod that Hera uses to watch over the heifer, the image is not arbitrary, it's not random. So that's the first thing. Then secondly, to tie it back to exactly, so Peterson, why is he doing this? He's saying, look, as a clinical psychologist, I think that's what you are. I think you are made up of personalities. And if they're not hierarchically arranged so that the highest principle is the thing that says, look, there's a purpose for all of this and it should be aimed at something good. And I'm willing to sacrifice whatever needs to be sacrificed in order to make sure we get there. If that's not the thing that's in charge, you're not going to have a good life. Your life isn't going to be impactfully meaningful into the future. The highest aims that you could accomplish, you won't be able to accomplish until you get that right. So he's looking at the science, which again, psychology has one foot solidly in science and one foot in the mythopoetic dream world for sure. But he's looking at, let's say, the humanities subject of psychology, and he's saying, this applies. This applies to everything. Now, you might say, well, how can these stories apply to everything? And the answer is the stories are about the origin of everything. If they're correct at all, if they're even approximately correct, the only way anything could be is as a reflection of that thing, because what we're aimed at is the ultimate source of what we are, right? So it shouldn't surprise us that the left and right hemisphere. So Jordan Peterson, one of his lenses is chaos and order. There's Zeus and Hera. There's these two principles that need to be in right communication with each other that all the various stories are getting at. There's the spirit of God hovering over the chaotic waters and speaking communication into it. Being is not that spirit, and being is not those waters. Being is these two things. And so if the stories are getting at something true, this yin yang symbol of the chasing, everything should be a reflection of that, since that's the source of everything. Well, you've got two genders that need to relate to each other properly. And if they're not, everything goes to hell. You've got two hemispheres of your brain that think in very different ways that need to communicate properly, or else psychologically you're in hell, right? So you start to say, okay, so one of the tests that Peterson talked about last time is, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to use multivariate analysis. Or I'm gonna say, look, if I think there might be a truth or a meaning that's profound in these stories, I'm gonna say, does it apply in 18 different, very different realms? And if it applies in the same way, if it's a simple thing it's saying, and yet it's true, profoundly true, or seems to be profoundly true in all these different areas, I'm gonna use that as evidence that we're getting closer to the true dream, or that there's something meaningful or potentially true in that dream. Now, of course, we don't have to go into what true means to analytic philosophers, which is it has to be propositional. But if there's a kind of true in that sort of thing, it's a way of being, it's an orientation, it's the proper relationship of the hierarchies of subpersonalities that constitute who we are. If there's something true there, one of his ways of testing it is in the context of this Aristotelian scientism that says, well, look, it better, it, there better not be even one science that proves it isn't true, right? Of course, you have to not do the objectivist presumption in order to deal with narrative and story because it's about characters and subjects. So that's off the table. You don't get to say you disproved it because it's considering subjects. You didn't disprove subjects. You just presumed that you shouldn't think about them in order to do science, and that's fine. But if you think you've extracted a truth out of these stories that the scientists say, "Oh, that's interesting. Let's test that." If that's true, this experiment should work out this way, and it works out the opposite. You need to say, "I didn't read the story correctly. I didn't extract real truth from it. It's not true empirically." If I think it has an empirical truth, the scientists are the ones that get to make those judgments because they're using the method for that. But maybe you might say, "That's not what the story was saying, and maybe I didn't read it properly." Or you might say it's not a very good story, right? There's other things you can say um, besides just, well, let's give up on stories. However, the other point Peterson's making is that the types of truths that these stories are about are not about those types of truths, right? So if you think you've got here's how gravity works, in a way that's useful within the objectivist framework of a scientist trying to come up with formulas for predictions, you're not approaching the story properly in the first place. It's not about that. It's presuming subjects. You are a subject, you are a personality. There's nothing illogical, unscientific, or anti-philosophical about this language. There's nothing from those realms that says you shouldn't do this, but it's presuming subjects, which is the antithesis of the way that you have to make progress in science, which is to say, let's try to get all of the subject removed from this so we're just left with the object. So therefore, why do you think you're getting objective truths out of it? You're not. You're getting something more profound and more important for talking to creatures that we know exist. You can make objective statements about the fact that people who think they have personalities exist, or I can do a rationalist experiment and say it's like something to be me in the world, and this language is talking to me in that way. So there's nothing illegitimate about doing it, but there's two mistakes that are being made. The Dawkinites and the fundamentalist Christians are both approaching the story to say, if it's true, it should be a science textbook because that's the ultimate kind of truth. Okay, we won't go into why that's ridiculous, but the Dawkinite types, and I'm not picking on Dawkins, right? I should actually take a moment to just talk a little bit about how impressive he is as a thinker and a contributor to this conversation, because I'm not trying to, but the Dawkinites, let's just say the cartoonish followers of Dawkins, the Dawkinites have this idea that if the way to judge it is if it's objectively true in that scientific kind of way, where let's get rid of subjects and personalities. Well, it's all about that. So obviously it's not. So then they judge the Bible as wrong and they dismiss it. But the fundamentalist Christians in America are saying, yeah, that is the ultimate kind of truth. So I'm going to read it in that way. And oh, look, the earth is 6,000 years old. Let's just study science more and we'll prove that that's really true because that's what the book was about. And to both of those camps, Peterson is saying, or gently suggesting perhaps, you might be missing the point of the story. You might not understand the legitimacy of this kind of language and how the truths it can tell you are way more profound than something that you'd have to adopt an objectivist fiction in order to even try to start doing in the first place. So maybe that's not the ultimate answer, but that's maybe where we are in this conversation, and worth highlighting. Let's go here. Okay, so again, the thing I should have just focused on is he's seeing psychology in that realm. So you look at the Greek pantheon, he says, yeah, that's a picture of a lot of everything. It's supposed to be a picture of how all things are the way they are now. So it's also a picture of your psychology. And Jung's idea is like, look, we're these subconscious ideas of Freud, they're actually personalities. There's living personalities within you, and some of them have to die, and some of them are not in proper relationships with the others, and some maybe need to be integrated, and some might be running amok. But for Peterson, who cares about psychology, he's saying, well, the way I can approach this science is to say, let's try to understand what's wrong about our stories, update them, because that might help us to orient this complicated pantheon of Mount Olympus that's inside each of our skulls. And again, it's not to reduce the story to being just about that either. It's not saying, oh, that's what the story was about. No, it's about evolution, and it's about domestication, and it's about everything that is, including our psychology. And then he's applying it that way. All right, good. Let's move.
Ooh, there's this postmodern idea about literature and about the world, for that matter, that if you take a complex piece of literature like a Shakespeare play, there's no end to the number of interpretations that you can make of it. You know, you can interpret each word, you can interpret each phrase, each sentence, each paragraph, you can interpret the entire play. The way you interpret it depends on how many other books you've read, depends on your orientation in the world. It depends on a very, very large number of things, how cultured you are or how much culture you lack, all of those things. It opens up a huge vista for potential interpretation. And so the postmodernists sort of stubbed their toe on that and thought, well, if there's this vast number of interpretations of any particular literary work, how can you be sure that any interpretation is more valid than any other interpretation? And if you can't be sure, then how do you even know those are great works? How do you know they can't? Maybe they're just works that the people in power have used to facilitate their continual accession of power, which is really a postmodern idea, and a very, very cynical one, but it has its point. But the thing is, it's grounded in something real, right? It's like, yes, you can interpret things forever. I want to show you something here, just briefly. We'll go back to it later. Look at this. This is one of the coolest things I've ever seen. So at the bottom here, every single one of those lines is a biblical verse, okay? Now, the length of the line is proportionate to how many times that verse is referred to in some way by some other verse. So you say, well, this is the first hyperlinked book, right? I'm dead serious about that. You can't click and get the hyperlinks, obviously, but it's a thoroughly hyperlinked book, and it's because, well, the people who worked on these stories that are hypothetically at the end, right, which is, the end can't affect the beginning. That's the rule of time, right? What happens now can't affect what happened to you 10 years ago, even though it actually can, but whatever. Well, you reinterpret things, right, and then they're not the same, but whatever, we won't get into that. But technically speaking, the present cannot affect the past, but if we're looking at a piece of literature, that's not right, because when you write the end, you know what was at the beginning, and when you write the beginning, or edit it, you know what's at the end, and so you can weave the whole thing together. And there's 65,000 cross-references, and that's what this map shows. And so that's a great visual representation of the book. And then you can see, well, why is it deep? Why is the book deep? Well, just imagine how many pathways you could take through that, right? I mean, you just journey through that forever. You'd never, ever get to the end of it. There's permutations and combinations, and every phrase is dependent on every other phrase, and every verse is dependent on every other, not entirely, but 65,000 is not a bad start. And so, okay, well, so that's another issue in some sense that seems to make the postmodernist critique even more correct. How in the world are you going to extract out a canonical interpretation of something like that? It's like it's not possible. But here's the issue, as far as I can tell. So the postmodernists extended that critique to the world. They said, look, well, a text is complicated enough. You can't extract out a canonical interpretation. What about the world? The world's way more complicated than a text, and so there's an infinite number of ways that you can look at the world. And so how do we know that any one way is better than any other way? That's a good question. Now, the postmodern answer was we can't. And that's not a good answer, because you drown in chaos under those circumstances, right? You can't make sense of anything. And that's not good, because it's not neutral to not make sense of things. It's very anxiety-provoking. It's very depressing, because if things are so chaotic that you can't get a handle on them, your body defaults into emergency preparation mode. and your heart rate goes up and your immune system stops working, and like you burn yourself out. You age rapidly because you're surrounded by nothing you can control. It's that's an existential crisis, right? It's anxiety provoking and depressing, very hard on people. And even more than that, it turns out that the way that we're constructed neurophysiologically is that we don't experience any positive emotion unless we have.
Okay, unfortunately, we had a late start today, and we're already 10 minutes over what we normally do with our hour and a half. So we're going to have to end this now. Um, and we will pick it up again where we left off next Saturday. Mark is out doing metallurgy today, which is super exciting. And Savad had a last minute thing come up. And so the whole crew will be back next time on Saturday, and we will continue our conversation in the year 3 material of looking at Jordan Peterson in the context of, um, well, the children that Nietzsche made possible, in a sense, right? So the backbone course for the year 1 material that we've been doing is very much cherry picking and focusing on 8 different sections of questions in philosophy and reading essays from different camps to get an idea of the battlefield. But the year 2 material is about starts out with exactly the stuff that Jordan Peterson's starting out with here in a lot of ways. There's a lot of overlap, and it's about a narrative way of re-looking at all of philosophy as an ongoing chronological story between fundamentally 2 camps that has a poetic cycle, almost like a spiral staircase, if you want to think of it that way. And that there are ways of understanding the progress of such a thing. And so we go from Thales to Socrates. We go from, it's like an ancient philosophy course and a medieval philosophy course and a modern. It's a whole bunch of courses put into one as the backbone. But then to complement that is something like the Consummate Thinkers course we did. So to complement the first year stuff is on Thursday and Friday, we are going to be starting 2 new classes. We are going to do the philosophy of mind, and we're going to be doing the philosophy of theology, or the philosophy of religion. And those 2 are going to be done in the year 1 style, where we're going to look at the subject as it's divided into different sections. We're going to read essays to get an idea of the different camps, maybe the more salient voices or salient camps, and what they're arguing against with each other, and the tools they think are appropriate, and that sort of a thing. So on Thursdays we're going to start philosophy of mind, and on Friday we're going to start philosophy of religion. What we've been doing is Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, we've been just doing the backbone course, but we're halfway through it now. So we're going to just continue doing that on Tuesdays, and we're going to look at 4 other questions now that we've finished the first 4: determinism, free will, the existence of God, the mind-body problem, and a meta-ethical question about subjectivity versus objectivity of moral judgments. We're going to move on to the last 4 sections in the backbone course for year 1 on Tuesdays, but we're going to start doing, in that same style, a more thorough examination of the philosophy of mind on Thursdays and the philosophy of religion, which I'm really excited about, on Fridays. However, when we get through all the year 1 material, there's a few other courses involved. At some point, we're going to start up this second year stuff, and the second year stuff is much more chronological. It's much more narrative. It's much more like the way Jordan Peterson is talking in some senses, about how there's a meta philosophical conversation that's happening about the conversation of philosophy, and 12 or so lenses that are very powerful through which we can place and understand the predictable emerging camps that happen, right? So after Descartes comes along, there's 2 camps that are wrestling with what he accomplished: the rationalists and the empiricists. Well, after Socrates came along, there's the Platonic and the Aristotelian cells that start diverging, and then going down those 2 same paths until you get to this crisis. And the same thing with Thales and Anaximander and Anaximenes, and that slight split ends up getting so crisis like that you need the Socrates, you need the next consummate thinker to come in and crucify himself on the both extremes and pull it all back together again. So that'll be our backbone course for year 2. And to complement that course, like the other courses we're going to be starting to complement the first year, we're going to be doing dialogues with Plato, and it's much more of like a seminary. It's like it's much more, we're reading whole works. So we're going to read the dialogues of Plato. We're going to be meditating with Descartes. We're going to be dealing with Kant. We're going to be reading all of Zarathustra. We're going to be looking at these thinkers that accomplished something. But in year 3 is actually where we do the backbone course is called Decoding Zarathustra. So we're going to start with that, and then the off the the intellectual traditions that emerged as a result include Jung and Peterson and William James and these pragmatists. They're all different, obviously, but the Kierkegaardian and Nietzschean existentialist thing is going to allow us to spend a lot of time. And so this is part of the year 3 stuff. This is a year 3 complementary course that's built to just say, hey, who is this Peterson guy and what is he about, and what can we get from what it is he thinks and how he thinks and what he's teaching. So that's what this is. We're going to end it. We're going to pick it up again on Saturday, and everybody will be back together again by then. But thanks for watching, and we'll talk to you later.